Chapter 1. A Newcomer at Netherfield. Everyone knows that a single man with a fortune must want a wife. His feelings may be unknown, but when such a man first enters a neighbourhood, all the families there immediately consider him the property of one of their daughters.
"My dear Mr. Bennet,"
said his lady one day,
"have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?"
Mr. Bennet answered that he had not.
"But it is,"
she said.
"Mrs. Long has just been there, and she told me all about it."
Mr. Bennet didn't answer.
"Do you not want to know who has taken it?"
cried his wife.
"You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it."
This was invitation enough.
"Why, my dear, you must know that Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a rich young man from the north of England, that he came down on Monday to see the place, and was so happy with it, he agreed to take it. His servants will be in the house by the end of next week."
"What is his name?"
"Bingley."
"Is he married or single?"
"Oh, single, my dear. A single man of large fortune. What a good thing for our girls."
"How so?"
"My dear Mr. Bennet,"
answered his wife,
"you must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them."
"Is that why he is coming here?"
"Nonsense. But it is very probable that he will fall in love with one of them, so you must visit him as soon as he comes."
"Why me? You and the girls can go. Or you can send them alone, which will be even better. You are as handsome as any of them. Mr. Bingley might like you best."
"My dear, you flatter me. When a woman has 5 daughters, she ought to stop thinking of her own beauty. But you must go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes."
"I cannot promise that."
"But think of your daughters. Think of Jane and Elizabeth. Think of Mary, Catherine and Lydia. Think what a fortune it would be for one of them. That is why Sir William and Lady Lucas are going. You must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not."
"I am sure Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will write to give him my permission to marry one of the girls, though I must say a good word for my little Lizzie."
"I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is no better than the others. She is not half as handsome as Jane, nor half as good-humoured as Lydia, but you always prefer her."
"They are all silly like other girls, but Lizzie is more intelligent than her sisters."
"Mr. Bennet, how can you speak so of your own children? You have no compassion on my poor nerves."
"You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. You have mentioned them with feeling for 20 years at least."
"Ah, you do not know what I suffer."
"I hope you will get over it and see many rich young men come into the neighbourhood."
"It will be no use, since you will not visit them."
"My dear, when there are 20, I will visit them all."
Mr. Bennet was one of the first to visit Mr. Bingley, as he had always planned. The surprise of his family when they heard was just what he had wanted. Not all the questions that Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters asked could get a description of Mr. Bingley from her husband. They had to hear the news from their neighbour, Lady Lucas. Her report was very favourable. He was young, handsome, friendly, and, best of all, he was coming to the next ball with a party of friends. Nothing could be better. To like dancing was a certain step to falling in love.
"If one of my daughters settles at Netherfield,"
said Mrs. Bennet to her husband,
"and the others are equally well married, I shall have no more to wish for."
A few days later, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit. He had hoped to meet the young ladies, but he saw only Mr. Bennet. An invitation to dinner was sent, but an answer soon arrived that Mr. Bingley had to go to town the next day. He was to return for the ball with his 2 sisters, the husband of the oldest, and another young man. At the ball they discovered that Mr. Bingley was a handsome gentleman with a simple, friendly manner, and his sisters were elegant women. Mr. Hurst, his brother-in-law, was just a gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, was a tall, handsome man with a noble appearance. A report soon went round that he had a very large fortune. Everyone looked at him with great admiration for half the evening, until he disgusted them all with his proud, unfriendly manners. Not all his large estate in Derbyshire could save him then. He could not be compared with his friend. Mr. Bingley soon met most of the people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, and talked about giving a ball at Netherfield. Mr. Darcy danced once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, refused to meet other ladies, and spoke only to his friends all evening. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped he would never come back. Mrs. Bennet was particularly angry with him for offending one of her daughters. Because there were few gentlemen, Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged to sit down for 2 dances. She had overheard a conversation between Mr. Bingley and his friend.
"Come, Darcy,"
said he.
"you must dance."
Certainly not. You know how much I despise it when I do not know my partner. Your sisters are not free, and you are dancing with the only handsome girl here.
Mr. Darcy looked at Jane Bennet.
Jane is the most beautiful girl I ever saw, but one of her sisters is very pretty. I can ask my partner to introduce you.
Which one?
Darcy turned round and looked at Elizabeth.
She is tolerable, but not handsome enough for me.
When Darcy walked off, Elizabeth told her friends the story. She had a playful character and enjoyed anything ridiculous. Later, when the sisters were alone, Jane told Elizabeth how much she liked Mr. Bingley.
"He is just what a young man should be,"
she said.
"Intelligent, agreeable, lively. I never saw such a happy manner."
"He is also handsome,"
said Elizabeth.
"which a young man should be if he possibly can."
"I was surprised that he asked me to dance twice. I did not expect such a compliment."
"I did for you. It was natural. You were 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room."
"Dear Lizzie."
"You know you like people in general too much. You never see a fault in anyone. And so, do you like this man's sisters too?"
"They are friendly women when you speak to them. I think they will be good neighbours."
Elizabeth was not convinced. The Bingleys were from a good family. The sisters were handsome and well-educated, but proud and conceited. They liked to think well of themselves and badly of others. Chapter 3. Mr. Collins Pays a Visit. Elizabeth spent most of the night in her sister's room. In the morning, Jane was better. She sent a note to her mother asking her to visit and decide what to do. Mrs. Bennet and her 2 youngest daughters arrived at Netherfield after breakfast. Although she was satisfied that Jane was in no danger, Mrs. Bennet did not listen to her proposal of going home. The doctor agreed. Miss Bingley then invited the mother and 3 daughters to the parlour. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Jane worse than expected.
"Indeed I did, sir.
She answered.
She is much too ill to be moved. We must depend a little longer on your kindness."
"You may depend on it, madam,"
said Miss Bingley coldly,
"that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention."
Soon afterwards, Mrs. Bennet asked for her carriage, thanking Mr. Bingley again for his kindness. When they had left, Elizabeth went immediately to Jane, leaving the 2 ladies to ridicule the behaviour of her relatives. The day passed much like the day before. Elizabeth spent the evening downstairs. She could not help noticing how frequently Mr. Darcy looked at her. When Miss Bingley played a lively song on the piano, he came to Elizabeth and said,
Do you not want to dance when you hear such music?
She smiled, but did not answer. He repeated the question.
"I heard you before.
She said.
but I did not immediately know what to answer. I know you wanted me to say yes, to give you the pleasure of ridiculing my taste. So I have decided to tell you that I do not want to dance at all. Now, ridicule me if you dare.
Indeed, I do not dare.
Elizabeth, expecting him to be angry, was surprised at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of impertinence and sweetness in her manner, which made it difficult for her to offend anybody. Darcy had never been as attracted by any woman as he was by her. He thought that only the inferiority of her connections saved him from the danger of falling in love. Miss Bingley saw this. Her anxiety that Jane get better soon came from her wish to see her sister leave. She often tried to make Darcy dislike Elizabeth by planning his happiness in an imagined marriage with her.
I hope,
She said as they were walking in the garden the next day,
you will teach your mother-in-law the advantage of silence, and if you can tell the younger girls not to run after the officers.
At that moment they met Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth.
I did not know you wanted to walk,
Said Miss Bingley in some embarrassment, fearing she had been overheard.
Why did you not tell us you were going to the garden?
Asked Mrs. Hurst, leaving Elizabeth and taking Darcy's free arm. The path was big enough only for three. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and said,
Let us move. This path is not wide enough.
But Elizabeth answered laughingly,
No, no. You make such a handsome picture. Another person would spoil it.
She ran off, happy in the thought of soon going home. Jane was so much better that she planned to leave her room for a few hours that evening. After dinner, Elizabeth helped her sister down to the drawing-room. Her friends welcomed her warmly. Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable. But when the gentlemen came in, Jane was quickly forgotten. Miss Bingley immediately went to speak to Darcy. He greeted Jane politely, but it was Bingley who was happiest to see her. After seeing that she was in no danger of the cold, he sat down by her and talked to nobody else. They decided not to play cards that evening. Darcy and Miss Bingley began to read. Mr. Hurst went to sleep, and his wife spoke a little to Jane and her brother. Hearing her brother speak to Jane about a ball, Miss Bingley said,
Charles, are you really thinking of a dance at Netherfield? I am sure there are some of us to whom a ball is no pleasure.
Are you speaking of Darcy?
cried her brother.
He can go to bed before it begins, but the ball is a certain thing.
Mr. Darcy had been speaking to Elizabeth when Caroline Bingley, tired of listening to this conversation in which she had no part, asked Mrs. Hurst to play some music. After a minute's thought, Darcy was not unhappy for it. He was beginning to feel the danger of giving Elizabeth too much attention. She attracted him more than he liked. It was a good thing that the two sisters were to go home to Longbourn the following day.
I hope, my dear,
said Mr. Bennet to his wife the next morning,
that you have a good dinner today, because I expect somebody to join us.
Who do you mean?
The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger.
The ladies were surprised and questioned him.
A month ago I received a letter from my cousin Mr. Collins, who will come to live in this house when I die.
In some families, it was agreed by law that property could only be left to men. If those families had only daughters, their houses and land would be left to any male relative after the father's death. Mr. Collins was Mr. Bennet's only male relative.
He writes that his father died some time ago, and that he wants us to forget the disagreement between our families,
Mr. Bennet said.
He is a man of the church, and has found an important patroness in the Honourable Lady Catherine de Burgh. He apologizes for the injustice done to our daughters because of his getting Longbourn, and would like to help them. This is the reason for his visit. We may expect the gentleman at 4 o'clock.
Mr. Collins was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His manners were very formal, and he soon complimented Mrs. Bennet on having such fine, beautiful daughters. He was sure, he said, that soon she would see them all well married.
You are very kind, sir, I am sure, and I hope it will be so, or indeed they will be very poor.
I know, madam, of my dear cousin's misfortune. I could say much on the subject. At present I will not say more, but I can assure the young ladies that I come ready to admire them.
At dinner, Mr. Bennet observed that Mr. Collins was very fortunate in his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins' manner was most serious, as he explained that never in his life had he seen such kindness in a great lady. She had already asked him twice to dine at Rosings. She made no objection to his joining in the society of the neighbourhood or to his visiting his relatives. She had even told him to marry as soon as he could, providing he chose the right wife, and had once visited him in his humble house.
Does she live near you?
Asked Mrs. Bennet.
The garden of my humble house is next to Rosings.
You said she is a widow, sir. Has she any family?
She has only one daughter who, one day, will have Rosings and a great fortune.
Ah!
Cried Mrs. Bennet.
Is she handsome?
She is a most charming young lady indeed. I have more than once said to Lady Catherine that her daughter was born to be a duchess. Such little attentions please her ladyship. It is happy for you to possess the talent of flattery,
said Mr. Bennet.
May I ask if you think of these pleasing attentions at the moment, or are they the result of study? I sometimes amuse myself with thinking of such little elegant compliments, but I always wish to give them in as natural a manner as possible.
Mr. Bennet was satisfied. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped. Having a good house and a sufficient fortune, Mr. Collins now intended to marry. His first choice was Jane, but a conversation with Mrs. Bennet the next day informed him of her hopes for Jane's marriage. He had only to change from her to Elizabeth. That day, Lydia planned to walk to Meryton to ask after a Mr. Denny, an officer she was friendly with. All her sisters, with the exception of Mary and Mr. Collins, decided to go with her. In pompous nothings on his side, and polite answers on that of his cousins, the time passed till they entered Meryton. From then on, the younger sisters were busy looking for officers. The attention of every lady was soon attracted by a young stranger of most gentlemanlike appearance. He was walking with Mr. Denny, who introduced him as a Mr. Wickham, an officer in his regiment. They were talking together when they saw Darcy and Bingley riding down the street. The two gentlemen came up. Bingley was just going to Longbourn, he told Jane, to ask after her. Suddenly, Elizabeth saw Darcy look at the stranger in surprise. Both men changed colour. Mr. Wickham touched his hat. In another minute, Bingley took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to Mr. Phillip's house. When Jane introduced Mr. Collins to her aunt, she received him with her very best politeness. She could not answer her niece's questions about Mr. Wickham, but promised to invite him to dinner with some other officers the next day. As they walked home, Elizabeth told Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen. Jane was surprised as well. Chapter 5. Mr. Collins proposes twice. The next day at Longbourn, Mr. Collins proposed marriage to Elizabeth. On finding Mrs. Bennet and Elizabeth together, he asked the mother for her permission to speak to her daughter alone. Elizabeth was too surprised to answer, but her mother immediately went away. Elizabeth sat down to listen, and tried not to show her feelings, which were divided between amusement and dislike.
Almost as soon as I came into this house,
Mr. Collins began,
I chose you for the partner of my life. But before my feelings get too strong for me, I must explain my motives for marrying and for coming here to Longbourn to look for a wife.
The idea of the serious Mr. Collins' strong feelings made Elizabeth so near to laughing that she could not stop him.
My motives for marrying are, first, that I think it right for every man of the church. Second, that I am sure it will make me very happy. And third, which perhaps I should have said first, that it was asked of me by the very noble lady whom I have the honour of calling patroness. Let me observe, my dear cousin, that the kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh is not the least of the advantages I have to give. It remains to tell why I looked in Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, where, I assure you, there are many agreeable young women. But as I am to get this estate after the death of your honoured father, who, however, may live many years longer, I could not be happy without deciding to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss be as little as possible when the unhappy day comes, which, however, as I have already said, may not be for some years. This has been my motive, my dear cousin, and I flatter myself it will not make you think less kindly of me. And now nothing remains for me but to assure you of the violence of my affections. To fortune I am indifferent. I shall ask nothing of your father, and shall, indeed, say nothing ungenerous on that subject when we are married.
It was necessary to stop him now.
You move too quickly, sir,
She cried.
You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do it without more loss of time. I thank you for the compliment, and feel the honour of your proposals, but I cannot do otherwise than answer no.
It is not new to me,
Said Mr. Collins,
that young ladies often refuse the proposals of the men they mean to accept.
Sir,
cried Elizabeth.
I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies. I am serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am sure that I am the last woman in the world to make you so.
But Mr. Collins would not believe her, though Elizabeth continued to refuse him.
You are completely charming.
He cried gallantly.
I am convinced that when you see my proposals are agreeable to your parents, they must be acceptable to you.
To this Elizabeth could give no answer, and left the room. When Mrs. Bennet returned to the breakfast-room, she was surprised to see Mr. Collins alone, and to hear his story. She immediately hurried to her husband, crying out,
"Oh, Mr. Bennet, you must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she says she will not have him, and if you do not hurry, he will change his mind and not have her."
I do not understand you.
said he when she had finished talking.
Of what are you talking?
Of Mr. Collins and Lizzie.
And what can I do? It seems a hopeless business.
Speak to Lizzie. Tell her that she must marry him.
Let her be called. She shall hear my opinion.
Elizabeth was called to her father's room.
Come here, my dear.
Cried her father as she appeared.
I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?
Elizabeth said that it was.
Very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused?
I have, sir.
Very well. Your mother says you must accept it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?
Yes, or I will never see her again.
An unhappy choice is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do.
Elizabeth had to smile, but Mrs. Bennet was very angry. She talked to Elizabeth again and again. Elizabeth answered, sometimes seriously, sometimes laughing, but though her manner varied, her determination never did. As for the gentleman, his feelings were mostly expressed by a severe manner and silence. He did not speak to Elizabeth. Later that day, Miss Lucas came to visit, and then his attentions were given to her. Her politeness in listening to him was a great help to Elizabeth. The next day, Mrs. Bennet's ill humour had not abated, nor had Mr. Collins' angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped he might soon leave, but it seemed he meant to stay. Later that day, Jane received a letter from Netherfield. Elizabeth saw her sister's face change as she read it. She tried to appear as always and soon joined in the general conversation, but Elizabeth felt a great anxiety on the subject. When the two sisters were alone, Jane took out the letter and said,
"This is from Caroline Bingley. It has surprised me very much. The whole party have left Netherfield and are going to London with no intention of returning. She says she is not sorry to leave anything except for my society, but hopes to enjoy that again some time. She asks me to write to her."
Elizabeth did not believe Miss Bingley's words. She was surprised they had gone so quickly, but did not think this would prevent Mr. Bingley from returning alone. This she said, but Jane continued,
"Caroline says that none of the party will return this winter. When Charles is in London, she writes, he will be in no hurry to leave again. This is why they have joined him there. It is clear that he will not return."
It is only clear that Miss Bingley does not want him to return,
said Elizabeth.
"You do not know all,"
objected Jane.
"Miss Bingley writes that Mr. Darcy wants to see his sister. Miss Georgiana Darcy is the most beautiful girl, she says, and she hopes that one day she will be their sister. Charles admires her greatly. If he married her, they would all be very happy. Is that not clear enough, my dear Lizzie? Can there be any other opinion on the subject?"
"Yes, because mine is different. Will you hear it?"
"Most gladly."
"It is this. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She goes to town in the hope of keeping him there and tries to make you think he feels nothing for you."
"No."
"Indeed, Jane, believe me, no one who has seen you together can question his affection. Could Miss Bingley have seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself, she would have been planning her own marriage."
Elizabeth soon had the pleasure of seeing Jane look happier at the thought that Bingley would return to Netherfield. The Bennets were invited to dine with the Lucases. Miss Lucas listened to Mr. Collins most of the day. Elizabeth could not know that her friend planned to save her from any further proposals from Mr. Collins by marrying him herself. Early the next morning, Mr. Collins left Longbourn House quietly and hurried to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at Charlotte's feet. His reception was very flattering. His proposals were immediately accepted. Sir William and Lady Lucas gave their permission, and Lady Lucas began to ask herself how many years Mr. Bennet would still live. Charlotte was satisfied. Mr. Collins was neither intelligent nor was his society agreeable. Still, he would be her husband. She did not think highly of men or matrimony, but marriage was the only honourable possibility for well-educated young women of small fortune. It might not make them happy, but it would save them from being poor. She had never been beautiful, and now, at 27, she felt fortunate. The worst thing was the surprise it would cause Elizabeth. She decided to give her the information herself, and asked Mr. Collins not to tell the family his news. As he was to set out early the next morning, Mr. Collins took his leave of the ladies at Longbourn that night. Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness, said how happy they would be if he visited them again. They were all most surprised when he immediately accepted this invitation and said he would be coming back very soon. The next morning, Charlotte came and told Elizabeth, who could not help crying out,
"Marry Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible!"
"Why are you surprised, my dear Eliza?"
Miss Lucas asked.
"Do you think it impossible that another woman might want to marry him because you did not?"
Elizabeth assured her that she wished her all imaginable happiness.
"I see what you are feeling,"
answered Charlotte.
"but I am not romantic, you know. I ask only a good home, and I am sure that I can be as happy with Mr. Collins as most married people.
Elizabeth quietly answered.
Surely.
Later she told her sister. Jane was surprised, but she did not think it impossible that Charlotte could be happy. Elizabeth and Charlotte spoke no more about the subject. Elizabeth felt that she could never speak openly with her friend again. As a result, she became even closer to her sister than in the past. Every day she was more anxious for Jane's happiness. Bingley had now been gone a week, and nothing was heard of his return. Jane had written to Caroline and was expecting to hear from her again. On Tuesday, a letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived, informing them that he hoped to accept their kind invitation to return to Longbourn in 2 weeks, as Lady Catherine wished him to marry soon. The days passed without news of Mr. Bingley. Even Elizabeth began to be anxious, not that Bingley did not love Jane, but that his sisters could keep him from returning. Their determination, together with the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London, might be stronger than his feelings for Jane. Miss Bingley's letter arrived and settled the matter. They planned to spend the winter in London, she began, and ended that her brother was sorry there had been no time to take his leave of them. Hope was over, completely over, and when Jane finished reading the letter, only the affection the writer expressed could make her feel better. Caroline wrote about the beautiful Miss Darcy and her hopes that she would marry Charles. He was now an intimate of Mr. Darcy's house. Elizabeth, to whom Jane soon told this, heard it in silent anger. She did not think Bingley's feelings for her sister had changed, but that his easy character had permitted his friends to interfere with his happiness and that of her sister. She was not sure if he knew of Jane's feelings for him or not, but in the end it made no difference. Jane's peace was disturbed. A day or two passed before Jane had the courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth.
"He has done nothing wrong,"
she said.
"At least I have not that unhappiness. A little time. I shall certainly try to get better. At least it has not been more than a mistake on my part."
My dear Jane,
Cried Elizabeth.
you are too good. I feel as if I never really knew you or loved you enough. There are few people I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it.
Dear Lizzie, do not let yourself feel like this, or you will never be happy. Please do not think badly of Mr. Bingley. We must not expect a lively young man to be always cautious. It is often nothing but our own vanity that makes us think admiration means more than it does.
To men's advantage.
I cannot believe that people try to do wrong or to make others unhappy.
Not try, but not thinking of other people's feelings, not being decisive, this may be enough to cause unhappiness.
You still think his sisters keep him away?
Yes, and his friend.
I cannot believe it. They can only wish for his happiness, and if he loves me, no other woman can give him that.
You are mistaken. They may wish many things other than his happiness. They may wish him a great fortune. They may wish him to marry a girl with all the importance of money and connections.
I am sure they do wish him to marry Miss Darcy,
answered Jane.
They have known her much longer than me, but it is very unlikely they should have gone against their brother's wishes. Please, let us not speak of it again.
Chapter 8. Embarrassment at Pemberley. It was May when Elizabeth and Jane returned to Longbourn. Their reception at home was most kind. Mrs. Bennet was happy to see Jane, as beautiful as always, and more than once during dinner Mr. Bennet told Elizabeth that he was glad she was back. On their first day home, Lydia wanted to walk to Meryton, but Elizabeth objected strongly. People should not say that the Miss Bennets could not be home for half a day before they ran after the officers. She did not want to meet Wickham, and hoped to avoid him as long as possible. Only the next morning could Elizabeth speak to Jane about her meeting with Mr. Darcy and the letter. She had decided not to mention Mr. Bingley. Jane was surprised at Darcy's proposal. She was sorry he had expressed his feelings in a manner so little pleasing to her sister, but still more for the unhappiness her refusal must have given him. When she heard of George Wickham, however, Jane's feelings were more serious.
"I do not know when I have been more shocked,"
she said.
"Wickham's so very bad. It is past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy. Dear Lizzie, only think what he must have suffered with the knowledge of your ill opinion too, and having to tell such a thing of his sister. It is really too bad. Lizzie, when you first read that letter, you must have felt it so."
I was very uncomfortable, I may say unhappy, and with no one to speak to of what I felt, no Jane to make me feel better, and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you!
The sisters decided against telling people about Wickham. His regiment was soon to move to Brighton for the summer. It did not seem important. At home, Elizabeth could now observe her sister's real feelings. Jane was not happy. She still felt a very strong affection for Bingley. She had never thought herself in love before, so her feelings had all the warmth of first attraction, and were, from her age and character, longer lasting. The second week after their return began. It was the last week of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were in despair. Only Jane and Elizabeth were still able to eat, drink, and sleep. Kitty and Lydia could not understand them.
What, oh, what shall we do?
They often cried desperately.
How can you smile so, Lizzie?
Their affectionate mother joined them in their feelings. She remembered what she herself had suffered at such a time 25 years ago.
"I am sure,"
said she,
"I cried for 2 whole days when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought I would die."
"I am sure I shall die,"
said Lydia.
"If only we could go to Brighton,"
observed Mrs. Bennet.
"Oh, yes, if only we could go, but Papa is so disagreeable."
Lydia's happiness soon returned, for she received an invitation to Brighton from her friend Mrs. Forster. This was a very young woman, just married to the colonel of the regiment. But where Lydia was happy, Kitty was mortified. In vain did Elizabeth and Jane speak to her. She refused to be comforted. Before the regiment departed, Elizabeth saw Mr. Wickham for the last time. He was invited to Longbourn with some other officers. On her return from Kent, she had learnt that the rich young lady who had taken her place in his affections had moved. Over dinner, Mr. Wickham spoke to her with a gallantry which caused her much displeasure. When he asked about her stay in Kent, she told him she had seen Mr. Darcy, and that she found him more agreeable now that she knew him better. Wickham looked anxious and said,
"I am happy that he is wise enough to try and appear a good man, but I imagine that he was only cautious to seem so at the house of his aunt, because of his wish of marrying Mr. Burr."
Elizabeth had to smile, but did not answer. A month before her planned journey to the lakes, Elizabeth received a letter from her aunt, informing her that instead of the lakes they had decided to go to Derbyshire, to the little town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had friends. Lambton was, Mrs. Gardiner wrote, 5 miles from Pemberley, the estate of Mr. Darcy, and old home of George Wickham. Elizabeth's feelings were mixed, but she consoled herself that there was small probability of meeting Darcy. 4 weeks passed, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner appeared at Longbourn. They stayed the night and left the next morning with Elizabeth. The evening before their arrival in Lambton, while talking over their travel plans, they saw that Pemberley was not more than 2 miles out of their way. Mrs. Gardiner expressed a wish to see the place, and asked Elizabeth if she wouldn't like to see a place to which so many of her friends were connected. Elizabeth knew not what to say. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley. She was tired of great houses, she told her aunt, but Mrs. Gardiner was determined.
"It is not only a great house,"
said she,
"but the gardens are some of the finest in England."
Elizabeth said no more, but she was uneasy. The possibility of meeting Darcy while visiting the place immediately came to mind. That night she asked the servant about Pemberley and if the family was there. The answer was no. Pemberley, a large, handsome house, delighted Elizabeth when she saw it. She had never seen a place of such natural beauty, and felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. The housekeeper, a respectable-looking older woman, showed them the house. The rooms were both simple and elegant.
"And of this place,"
she thought,
"I might have been mistress. I might have enjoyed it as my own, and welcomed as visitors my uncle and aunt. But no, that could never be. They would have been lost to me. He would not have permitted me to invite them."
This fortunate thought saved her from feeling almost sorry. When her aunt called her to look at a picture, the housekeeper came forward and said,
"That is my master, and very like him."
"I have heard of your master,"
said Mrs. Gardiner.
"Lizzie, you can tell us if it is like or not."
The housekeeper asked if she knew Mr. Darcy.
"A little,"
said Elizabeth.
"Do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?"
"Yes, very handsome."
The housekeeper, either from pride or affection, clearly had great pleasure in talking about him. Mr. Gardiner asked her about him. Elizabeth listened with surprise as she said,
"I never had an unkind word from him in my life, and I have known him since he was 4 years old. There is not one of his servants who does not speak well of him. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw that."
As they walked through the rooms, Elizabeth was stopped by the sight of a large portrait. It was of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile on his face as she remembered to have seen sometimes when he looked at her. There was, at this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a warmer feeling towards the man than she had ever felt before. The picture of his character given by his housekeeper was a compliment indeed. When they had seen what was open of the house, they took their leave. As they walked through the garden, Elizabeth turned back to look again, when suddenly she saw Darcy himself. They were so near that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes met, and they both blushed deeply. He looked, and for a moment could not move for surprise, but then came up and spoke to Elizabeth politely, explaining that he had come a day early. She had turned away, but stopping, received his compliments with mortification. The thought of the impropriety of her being there made those moments some of the most uncomfortable of her life. He, too, was not at ease. After standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly took his leave. The others then joined her and expressed their admiration, but Elizabeth heard not a word. She was so ashamed. Her coming there was the most unfortunate thing in the world. Oh, why did he come a day before he was expected? And his behaviour so changed. What could it mean? She was surprised that he should even speak to her, but to speak so politely, to ask after her family. Never in her life had she seen his manners so little formal. Never had he spoken so kindly as on this unexpected meeting. They were walking on when Mr. Darcy came up again, and asked if Elizabeth would do him the honour of introducing him to her friends. She almost smiled when she remembered what he had once said of her connections.
What will be his surprise,
thought she,
when he knows who they are? He now thinks they are people of fashion.
The introduction was made. Mr. Darcy turned back with them and started a conversation with Mr. Gardner. Elizabeth was very pleased that he should know she had some relatives to be proud of. She listened and triumphed at every word of her uncle's that showed his intelligence or his good manners. They began to speak of fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him to fish there as often as he liked while in the neighbourhood. Mrs. Gardner gave Elizabeth a look of surprise. Elizabeth said nothing, but was very gratified. The compliment must be for herself, but she kept thinking,
Why is he so changed? It cannot be for me that his manners are so softened. It is impossible that he should still love me.
After some time, Mrs. Gardner, tired from the walk, asked for her husband's arm, and Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece. Elizabeth spoke first. She wanted him to know that she had been assured he was away from home before she came to the place. He had come early on business, he explained. The party who travelled with him was joining him the next day.
There are some of them who you know, Mr. Bingley and his sisters.
Elizabeth did not answer.
There is one other person in the party who wished to be known to you. Will you permit me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you during your stay at Lambton?
They walked on in silence. Elizabeth was not comfortable, but she was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. At the house, Mr. Darcy invited them to tea, but they refused and took their leave. The observations of her aunt and uncle now began. Both thought him much better than anything they had expected.
There is something a little formal in him, but only in his manner,
said her aunt.
I was never more surprised than by his behaviour to us. It was more than polite. It was really attentive, and there was no necessity. He does not know Elizabeth so well.
Her uncle added.
Indeed, Lizzie,
said her aunt.
He is not as handsome as Wickham, but how could you tell us that he was disagreeable? It is hard to believe he can have behaved so badly to poor Wickham.
Elizabeth explained that his character was not so bad, nor Wickham's as good as they had thought. The Gardners were shocked, but as they were now nearing Lambton, there was no time to say more. On the morning after their arrival at Lambton, they heard the sound of a carriage. It was Darcy. When Elizabeth told her uncle and aunt, they were most surprised, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke opened to them a new idea on the business. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and the introduction took place. Elizabeth saw that the young lady was as much embarrassed as she. She had heard that Miss Darcy was proud, but the observation of a few minutes showed her that she was only timid. They had not been long together before Darcy told her that Bingley also was coming. A moment later he entered the room and greeted her warmly. He asked in a friendly, though general way, after her family. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, Bingley was a most interesting person. They observed the whole party with attention. Their suspicions of Mr. Darcy and their niece made them watch each closely, and they soon saw that one of them at least knew what it was to love. The lady's feelings they did not quite understand, but the gentleman was clearly full of admiration. In seeing Bingley, Elizabeth immediately thought of Jane. She watched his behaviour to Miss Darcy, but saw nothing that spoke of affection in his manner to her. At one point he observed to Elizabeth that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her, and then asked if all her sisters were at Longbourn, with a look and a manner that gave the words meaning. When their visitors got up to depart, Mr. Darcy asked his sister to join him in inviting the Gardners and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley. They accepted, and a day was decided. Chapter 10. Elizabeth Learns the Truth. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of an answer soon. It read,
My dear niece, I have just received your letter and must say that I was surprised at it. I did not think it necessary for you to ask for information. Your uncle also believed that you knew what was happening at the time. But let me explain. On the day I came home from Longbourn, your uncle had an unexpected visit from Mr. Darcy. He came to say that he had found your sister and Mr. Wickham and had talked to them. The reason he gave was that it was his fault alone that Wickham's true character had been unknown. If he had been more open in the past, no young woman could have fallen in love with Wickham. Mr. Darcy generously felt his mistaken pride was the cause of all our unhappiness, and so he had to help us now. If he had another motive, I am sure it was a good one. When Mr. Darcy spoke to Lydia, he offered to help her leave Wickham and come home, but she would not do so. She wanted no help and would not hear of leaving Wickham. She was sure they would get married some day. Then he spoke to Wickham and found he had no intention of marrying Lydia. Wickham told him he had to leave his regiment because of problems with money. Mr. Darcy asked him why he had not married your sister. Mr. Bennet was not very rich, but he and your uncle would have helped Wickham as much as they could. But Wickham, it seemed, still hoped to marry some young lady with a great fortune, perhaps in another part of England. Mr. Darcy saw how desperate Wickham's situation was, and understood that he would marry Lydia if offered enough money. When Mr. Darcy came to us, your uncle wanted to give him back the money he had paid Wickham, but he refused. They talked for a long time, but your uncle could do nothing. But, Lizzie, nobody must know of this. Only you, or perhaps Jane. That is all. I hope the story will cause you no displeasure. We saw Mr. Darcy at the wedding, and the next day he dined with us. Will you be angry with me, my dear Lizzie, if I now say how much I like him? His behaviour to us has been as pleasing as when we were in Derbyshire. His understanding and opinions all please me. He needs nothing but a little more liveliness, and that his wife may teach him. But I must write no more. Yours, M. Gardner.
Elizabeth did not know if she felt more pain or pleasure. Mr. Darcy had done all this. He had had to meet the man he most wished to avoid, to talk to him and give him money. He had done this for her sister. Her heart said he had done it for her. But this hope lasted only a moment. He could not have, for a woman who had already refused him once had become a relative of Wickham's. Oh, how she suffered to remember all the impudent things she had said in the past. She was mortified, but she was proud of him. The day of Wickham and Lydia's journey north came. Mrs. Bennet was quite unhappy for several days, until she heard that the housekeeper at Netherfield had received word her master was coming in a day or two.
Well, well, and so Mr. Bingley is coming,
she said.
So much the better. He is nothing to us, and I am sure I never want to see him again. But he is very welcome to come to Netherfield if he likes, and who knows what may happen.
Jane had not been able to hear of his coming without blushing. When they were alone, she assured Elizabeth that the news did not cause her pleasure or suffering. She was only glad he came alone, because they would see less of him. Over the next days, Mrs. Bennet talked of nothing else, till Jane had told a bear. Over the next days, Mrs. Bennet talked of nothing else, till Jane told Elizabeth she was beginning to be sorry that he was coming at all. She would be happy when his stay at Netherfield was over. On the third morning after Mr. Bingley's arrival, he came to visit.
"There is a gentleman with him, Mamma,"
said Kitty.
"Who can it be? Oh, it looks just like the man who was with him before, Mr. What's his name? That tall, proud man."
Mr. Darcy, and so it does.
Jane looked at Elizabeth with surprise. Both sisters were uncomfortable. Each felt for the other. Their mother talked on of her dislike for Mr. Darcy, and her decision to be polite to him only as Mr. Bingley's friend. When the gentleman came in, Elizabeth said as little to either as politeness would allow. She only looked once at Darcy, who seemed as serious as usual. Bingley she had seen for a moment, looking both pleased and embarrassed. He was received by Mrs. Bennet with a politeness which made her daughters ashamed, especially when contrasted with the cold politeness to Mr. Darcy, who, after asking her how Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were, said almost nothing. He seemed more thoughtful and less anxious to please than when they had last met. She asked after his sister, but could do no more.
"It is a long time, Mr. Bingley, since you went away,"
said Mrs. Bennet. He agreed.
"I began to be afraid you would never come back. A great many changes have happened since you went away. Miss Lucas is married, and one of my own daughters. Have you heard of it?"
Bingley gave her his compliments.
"It is a delightful thing to have a daughter well married,"
she continued. Elizabeth was so ashamed she could not look up. How Mr. Darcy looked she could not tell. She only felt better when she saw Bingley, attracted again by Jane's beauty, speak to her more and more. He found her as beautiful as last year and as agreeable, if more silent. When the gentlemen got up to go, Mrs. Bennet invited them to dinner a few days later. Elizabeth was left to think about Mr. Darcy's behaviour.
Why, if he came only to be severe and silent and indifferent, did he come at all?
She thought.
If he could still be pleasing to my uncle and aunt, why not to me?
Jane soon joined her with a happy look.
"Now,"
said she,
"that this first meeting is over, I feel easy. I shall never be embarrassed again by his coming. I am glad he dines here. It will then be seen that we meet only in a friendly manner."
At the dinner at Longbourn, Elizabeth observed Bingley's behaviour to her sister. He showed an admiration which made her think that Jane's happiness and his own would soon be settled, if he could decide alone. She looked at Mr. Darcy, but he did not show his feelings. He was seated far from her, next to her mother. She could not hear any of their conversation, but she could see how little they spoke to each other, and how formal and cold was their manner. Her mother's impoliteness made the thought of what he had done for them even harder. She would have given anything to tell him that his kindness was known and felt by her, and hoped the evening would bring them together. After dinner, she waited only for the men to return.
"If he does not come to me then,"
said she,
"I shall forget him."
The gentleman came, and she thought he looked as if he would have answered her hopes, but there was no place around the table where she and Jane were making tea and coffee. Darcy walked away. She followed him with her eyes, angry with herself for her feelings. A man who had once been refused. How could she expect a renewal of his love? When he came up to her later, she took the chance of saying,
"Is your sister at Pemberley still?"
Yes, she will remain for some time.
She could think of nothing more to say, and had no chance to speak to him alone that evening. A few days later, Mr. Bingley visited again, alone, because his friend had left for London that morning for 10 days. Mrs. Bennet invited him to dine, and although it was not possible that day, he accepted the invitation immediately for the following day. Over the next days, Mr. Bingley visited often. One day, Elizabeth walked into the drawing-room and saw her sister and Bingley standing close together, speaking seriously. They quickly turned around, and their faces told it all. They did not speak, till Bingley said a few words to Jane and hurriedly left the room. Jane immediately kissed her sister and told her she was the happiest woman in the world.
"It is too much,"
she said.
"Far too much. Oh, why is not everybody as happy? But I must go this minute to my mother. He has gone to my father already. Oh, Lizzie, how is it possible to be so happy?
When Bingley returned, he came up to her and asked her for the good wishes and affection of a sister. Elizabeth warmly expressed her delight. When she could speak, Mrs. Bennet said to her daughter,
"Oh, my dear, dear Jane, I am so happy. I am sure I shall not sleep all night. I always said it must be so. I was sure you could not be so beautiful for nothing."
Wickham and Lydia were all forgotten. Jane was her favourite. Chapter 11. Triumph over Pride and Prejudice. One morning, about a week later, the family was sitting in the dining room when a carriage came up to the door. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She entered the room with a manner more than usually unfriendly and sat down. After a moment, she turned to Elizabeth and said,
I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. That lady, I expect, is your mother.
Elizabeth answered that it was.
And that, I expect, is one of your sisters.
Mrs. Bennet said that it was.
"May I ask your ladyship if you left Mr. and Mrs. Collins well?"
she asked.
Yes, very well. I saw them last night.
At that, Lady Catherine got up and asked Elizabeth to walk with her in the garden, where she said,
You must understand, Miss Bennet, the motive for my journey.
Elizabeth looked surprised and assured her that she was mistaken.
Miss Bennet,
Answered her ladyship in an angry tone.
You must know that it is in my character always to say what I think. I shall not change now. I was told a most scandalous story 2 days ago, that Miss Elizabeth Bennet would probably soon marry Mr. Darcy. I knew, of course, that it was not true, that he would never do such a thing. I decided to come here immediately to tell you of my feelings on the matter.
If you did not believe it true,
Said Elizabeth.
why did you come?
I came to hear you say it is not true. Has Mr. Darcy made you an offer of marriage?
Your ladyship has said that is impossible.
It should be so, but you may have made him forget how he should behave.
If I had, I would be the last person to say so.
Miss Bennet, nobody speaks to me like this. You must understand me. This marriage can never take place. Mr. Darcy is to marry my daughter. Now what have you to say?
If that is so, you can have no reason to imagine he will make an offer to me.
Lady Catherine was silent for a moment, and then said,
From the beginning they were meant for each other. It was the favourite wish of his mother and mine. Are they not to be married because of a young woman of no importance in the world?
Is there no other objection to my marrying Mr. Darcy but an agreement between his mother and you? Has Mr. Darcy no choice in the matter? And if I am that choice, why may I not accept him?
I am ashamed of you. Is this your thanks for my attentions to you? You, a young woman without family connections or fortune?
Mr. Darcy is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter.
You are a gentleman's daughter. But who was your mother? Who are your uncles and aunts?
Whatever my connections may be,
said Elizabeth,
if Mr. Darcy does not object, they can be nothing to you.
Tell me now, are you to marry him?
I am not.
And will you promise me never to marry him?
I will make no promise of the kind.
Miss Bennet, I know the story of your sister's marriage to Mr. Wickham. Is such a girl to be Mr. Darcy's sister?
You have now said everything possible to offend me. I have nothing more to say.
Elizabeth got up, and they walked back to the house. For many hours after Lady Catherine's departure, Elizabeth could not think clearly. She had said she would prevent their marriage. Would she now speak to Mr. Darcy? With his idea of family pride, he might feel his aunt was not wrong. If in the next few days he wrote to Bingley saying that he could not return to Netherfield, she would understand. She would then stop thinking of him. No letter came from Mr. Darcy, but a few days later he came to Longbourn himself. Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, had the idea of walking out together. They walked slowly behind, while Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy walked ahead. Now was the moment to speak.
Mr. Darcy,
Elizabeth began.
I must thank you for your great kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I have known it, I have been anxious to tell you how grateful I am.
I am very sorry that you were informed of it. I did not think Mrs. Gardiner would tell you.
It was Lydia who spoke thoughtlessly. Let me thank you again and again in the name of all my family.
If you will thank me,
He answered.
thank me for yourself. Much as I respect your family, I thought only of you.
Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a moment, he said,
You are too generous to play with my feelings. My affections and wishes are unchanged. If you feel the same as you did last April, tell me so immediately, and I will be silent.
Elizabeth, feeling all the anxiety of his situation, told him that her feelings had changed so much that she would now receive his proposal with gratitude and pleasure. The happiness this caused him was greater than any he had ever known. He spoke as intelligently and warmly as a man violently in love can do. Elizabeth could not look at him. She could only listen in delight as he told of his feelings for her. They walked on, not knowing where. There was too much to be thought and felt and said. She soon heard that they could thank his aunt for their present happiness. She had visited him and told him of her conversation with Elizabeth.
It taught me to hope,
Said he.
as I had never hoped before. I knew your character well enough to be certain that if you had decided against me, you would have told Lady Catherine so.
Elizabeth blushed and laughed.
Yes, after saying the worst things to your face, I could say them to your relatives too.
What did you say that was untrue? My behaviour to you was despicable.
We shall not disagree on who was more at fault.
Said Elizabeth.
Since then, I hope we are both changed for the better.
I cannot so easily forget the things I said, my manners to you, your words when you said to me, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner? You do not know how those words have made me suffer.
I had no idea you would feel them like that.
I can believe it. You thought me without any proper feeling. I'm sure you did. I shall never forget your face when you said that I could not propose to you in any way that would make you accept me.
Oh, do not repeat what I said then. I have long been so ashamed of it.
Darcy mentioned his letter.
Did it,
Said he.
soon make you think better of me?
She explained how she had felt and how, slowly, all her prejudices had disappeared. They spoke about their meeting at Pemberley.
I only wanted to show you that I was not angry about the past.
Darcy said.
I hoped for your forgiveness. How soon I felt other wishes, I cannot say. But I believe about half an hour after I had seen you.
After walking a long way, they found at last that it was time to be at home. Where could Bingley and Jane be? Darcy expressed his delight at the news his friend had given him. In picturing Bingley's happiness, which would only be less than his own, he continued the conversation till they got home. That night, Elizabeth opened her heart to her sister, who could not believe the news.
You are not serious, Lizzie. This cannot be, to marry Mr. Darcy. I know it is not true.
This is a bad beginning indeed. I am sure nobody else will believe me if you do not. But I am speaking the truth. He still loves me, and we are to be married.
Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. I know how much you dislike him.
You know nothing of the matter. Perhaps I did not always love him as well as I do now, but that must all be forgotten.
I must believe you,
cried Jane.
My dear, dear Lizzie, forgive the question, but are you quite sure that you can be happy with him?
Quite. It is settled between us already that we shall be the happiest people in the world.
And do you really love him well enough? Oh, Lizzie, do anything, but do not marry without affection. Are you quite sure that you feel what you should?
When Jane was satisfied about the strength of Elizabeth's affection for Darcy, she said,
Now I am quite happy, for you will be as happy as myself.
Oh, no!
cried Mrs. Bennet the next morning.
That disagreeable Mr. Darcy is here again with our dear Bingley. What shall we do with him? Lizzie, you must walk out with him again.
That evening, when Mr. Bennet left the drawing-room, Darcy got up and followed him. When he appeared again, he smiled at Elizabeth and sent her to her father. When Elizabeth came into the room, her father was walking around looking anxious.
Lizzie,
Said he,
what are you doing? Have you not always hated this man?
How she wished then that she had not expressed her former opinions so strongly. She tried to assure her father of her affection for Darcy.
Lizzie,
Said he,
I know that you could never be happy unless you truly loved and respected your husband.
Elizabeth explained the slow change of her feelings. She assured her father that Darcy had loved her for many months, and that he was not the proud, disagreeable man she had thought. At last, she told him what he had done for Lydia.
Well, my dear,
He said,
if this is true, then he is indeed the man for you.
Later that night, Elizabeth told her mother. On hearing the news, Mrs. Bennet could not say a word. It was many, many minutes before she could understand. Finally, she said,
Dear me! Mr. Darcy! Who would have thought it? And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and great you will be! Jane is nothing to it. I am so happy. Such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, please apologise for my having disliked him so much before. I hope he will forget it. Dear, dear Lizzie, 3 daughters married.
Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet saw her 2 oldest daughters married. How she delighted in visiting Mrs. Bingley and talking of Mrs. Darcy. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter greatly. His affection for her often brought him to Pemberley. Mr. Bingley and Jane stayed at Netherfield only a year. To the satisfaction of the 2 sisters, Mr. Bingley then bought an estate only 30 miles from Pemberley. Pemberley was Georgiana's home now, and the attachment of the 2 sisters was just what Darcy had hoped. They learned to love each other very much. Lady Catherine sent Darcy such an angry letter on hearing about the marriage that, for a time, all contact stopped. With the Gardiners, they were intimate. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were always grateful to the people who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had united them.